Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's session titled Strategic Implications of Chinese State Capitalism. We're delighted to partner again with ASCGS. Peter, you're going to introduce all speakers here. So welcome to all speakers here and to all attendees. China certainly poses some strategic implications and challenges. Maybe in Europe, where we see it more as an economic challenge, in the US more, and including geopolitical, geoeconomic challenges. Certainly China might have achieved some economic success, but it's not politically liberalized. So what we witnessed in Germany, for instance, after the Second World War, that economic liberalization, economic success went in parallel, hand in hand with political liberalization. This is happening in China. So how do we deal with a more regressive China? How do we deal with an economy which might surpass the US and the Western economies in the not too distant future? How can we engage in a constructive engagement and dialogue with China? All these are questions I think we're going to find and seek some solutions today. We're delighted to have this project together with ASCGS. Today's session is part of a series including podcasts, in-person conferences. And these all actions aim at one big objective. We want to have a transatlantic approach towards international and geopolitical challenges. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to all of you for attending today. Thank you. I forgot to mention, I'm Christian, Christian Forstner with the Hans Seidel Foundation. Hans Seidel, it's a think tank based headquartered in Munich. We have an office in Washington, so I'm delighted to be part of it. Welcome to everybody, Christian. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christian. And that prompts me to say right at the beginning that I'm Peter Rashers, the director of the Geoeconomics program at AICGS. And let me join Christian in welcoming all of you and welcoming our panelists. We're delighted that we could cooperate with the Hans Seidel Foundation on this project. Let me also thank my colleague, Yishang Xu, who is the China Fellow at AICGS, for his very valuable help with the planning and organization for today's webinar. When I look at the topic today, the strategic implications of China's state capitalism, we see that the Biden administration has, together with the EU, launched a Trade and Technology Council, and more recently with a number of Asian partners, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which to a greater or lesser degree have China explicitly in mind, but they do seek to align with like-minded economies on supply chains, clean energy, new technologies, and other issues where there's certainly a challenge from China to, I think, both transatlantic values and interests. And these efforts are taking place at a time when Germany and others in the EU are seeking to find a new path towards China, perhaps reduce some of their dependence on China in strategic sectors, and at the same time are seeing the value in stronger cooperation with the US and other partners. Today, we are really fortunate to have four strong China policy experts, both in the United States and Europe, who will share their views today. So let me introduce them briefly before we get started. François Chimits is an analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, or MERICS, in Berlin, where he focuses on the economic development of China and its role in foreign trade. Earlier, he was an economist and deputy head of the Trade Policy Department at the French Ministry of Economy and Finance, and he's also worked as an analyst at the French Embassy in Beijing. Ilaria Mazzocco is a fellow with the trustee chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, here in Washington. Previously, she was a senior research associate at the Paulson Institute, where she led the research on Chinese climate and energy policy for Macro Polo, the Institute's think tank. Nargiza Salidjanova is a director with Rhodium Group's China practice. She leads the firm's analysis of China's economic system, technology development, and its global engagement. And before that, she was a director for economics and trade with the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which is a congressional advisory body. Finally, Matt Turpin is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and former director for China on the US National Security Council. He is also a senior advisor at Palantir Technologies. Matt spent several years in the US Army, during which he among other posts, served as an advisor on China to the chairman and vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So to kick things off, we'll hear from each panelist for 5 to 7 minutes or so, and then I will moderate a discussion among them. Following that, we look forward to opening up the panel to the floor to your questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button on your screen. So why don't we start with a U.S. perspective, and to do that, I'll hand it over to Matt Turpin.
Well, Peter, thank you, and thanks to my fellow panel members. Real pleasure to be here. I think I'll start off with maybe just a quick sort of recap of kind of where we are, at least in sort of U.S. policy towards China. I typically view it as that we've kind of gone through what is largely considered sort of be 3 phases of sort of U.S. policy towards China. There was a sort of first phase from reestablishment of relations to 79, really going up to the end of the Cold War, which was really U.S. policy was through the lens of the Cold War, in which the United States had largely reestablished a relationship with China, largely through the lens of hedging or balancing against the Soviet Union. And as the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended, U.S. policy went through a transition period, sort of from 1991 through 1994, when President Clinton sort of famously sort of shifted sort of his position on China and really adopted what became sort of what I see as the second phase of U.S.-China relations, in which the United States sort of viewed a policy of economic development and engagement in order to bring about the kind of political liberalization inside the PRC that we had hoped to see. And I think this was an approach that we shared certainly with our friends and allies across Europe, certainly a policy that we shared in Korea and across Asia, where essentially, as the PRC sought to reform and open, we would complement that with the idea that it would eventually bring about the kind of political liberalization that we had seen, in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall across Eastern Europe, and that would sort of carry its way through. And that phase began to sort of kind of come apart around about 2014, 2015, as the end of the Obama administration began to debate internally whether or not that policy engagement leading to political liberalization was really something that was going to work. And we've kind of entered into the third of really what is strategic rivalry. And that was something that was sort of being debated in the last 18 to 12 months. The Obama administration was the approach that the Trump administration, you could see this through the publishing of a national security strategy and a number of other sort of activities. And obviously the Biden administration continued that on. And you can see that in speeches and documents that the Biden administration has published, and its position with its partners around the world, right? And so that's, I think we are seeing ourselves in that phase. And that phase is sort of likely to be with us for quite some time from a U.S. perspective. I think, one thing that sort of, before we sort of shift to sort of perspective across the transatlantic, I think it's important to find that Japan has also gone through this transition, but it sort of went through this transition a few years before the United States. And Tokyo has certainly, with term Mr. Abe Shinzo, starting in late 2012, on a position shifting from one of sort of economic engagement to one of strategic rivalry, starting during that period of time. And Japan has begun to shift its policies in similar ways. The language of a free and open Indo-Pacific is not Washington's language, it's actually Tokyo's language. And so to a large extent, that has already gone about. And I can imagine, as and maybe we'll cover a little bit more from some of my other panelists, is that this seemed to be a part of the discussion at the G7, and I bet that Prime Minister Kishida was one of the leading voices advocating for these positions, as Tokyo has been a leading advocate in Washington, since the end of the Obama administration. So maybe I'll stop there and open it up to my colleagues.
Thank you, Matt. Why don't we turn now for a European view to François Chimits?
Yeah, actually, MERICS is a German institute, but I'm currently based in Brussels. We just opened an office there, so definitely giving some European perspective. But first, let's go back very quickly to the general direction that China has taken over the past couple of years, and one that is largely driven by an internal reasons, and that is the acknowledgement in Beijing of the need to shift the economic model in order to avoid what they see as being the middle income trap, and in order to shift away from an extensive growth and toward an intensive growth, so a better use of the resources. And that has taken an incremental shape slowly, and we've seen it, and I think that explains why it has taken a long time for most external analysts to understand exactly what was the plan of Beijing behind that new development model. And that is a blend of both market forces and state guidance. And so depending on where you look at it, you might have the impression that China is moving towards reform or towards more interventionist types of policies, where actually there is the ambition, and then comes the question of whether they will succeed, but there is the ambition, I think, to blend it in a very different way. And plus, on the top of it, I think with both the external shock of the trade and technology war with the US under Mr. Trump, and then the COVID situation, a refocusing of the objective towards resilience and away from a more quantitative wealth creation metric. And that, I think, explains what type of partner now we are confronted with, or we have to deal with. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's possible that we have lost the few capacity we used to have to change the direction of China from the outside. And I think we have almost acknowledged that in the EU with the refocus of the priorities, at least the operational measures that have been taken over the past 5 years toward protecting the domestic market from the spillovers of the Chinese weird, unusual economic model. That was the intention in the EU. And if you look at the scope of the toolbox that has been either updated or created, it's actually very impressive. You've had the entire sets of trade defense instruments that were reviewed and then used much more extensively, especially towards China, including on a qualitative dimension towards distortions that previous to that were very difficult or often not catched at all in such instruments. And here I'm thinking of transnational subsidies along the Belt and Road, for instance, or even CCP intrusion within private firms through either Communist Party sales or even top management being party members. And that is, from a small Brussels bubble perspective, really a revolution in terms of daring to try to use more extensively and more innovatively those typical tools that so far had struggled to capture and to shield the European market from the Chinese distortion. Now what we are seeing is a new phase where the EU is trying to use more extensively those new tools, at the same time as it's also trying to have a more of a domestic positive agenda in order to reduce resilience, because as the Chinese have acknowledged, an issue or a new perspective of what is interdependencies with a non-allied or non-friendly state, the EU is also going down a similar road, at least in terms of acknowledgement. And we are now seeing a much clearer ambition to reduce those dependencies. And then the intention is clear. What is absolutely not clear and has been a bit pending or still up in the air for the past 18 months is how do you do that? And comes the question of the European Union capacity in terms of ideology, politics, and even administrative capacity to reduce those dependencies. And I think that's something we have to bear in mind, especially when you look at the difference between the US and the EU. Still, the general direction is actually rather clear in terms of acknowledging that there needs to be a change in the way we approach China and a more forceful enforcement of our values and preferences in our relationship, especially economic relationship with China. And that is captured by the change of label, the famous one, China being now a systemic rival, at least in part a systemic rival to the European Union, as well as a commission that has the ambition to be a geopolitical ambition and a EU trade policy that is now guided under an open strategic autonomy. Those looks a bit semantic and theoretical, but from a Brussels perspective, this is really huge changes if you look at the past decades or the past 2 decades of ideological underpinning of the European Brussels conversation regarding China.
Okay, thank you, François. Nargiza, how do you see things?
Thank you, Peter, and delighted to join this wonderful group to speak here today. So let me limit my remarks to 3 main points to just kick us off. And I think it's really great to be going sort of following after Matt and François in this regard, because I think the diagnosis of what is the challenge has been ongoing for many years, right? This is not new. This has not been precipitated by the Trump administration, although we've seen kind of an articulation of a very activist posture then. But there is still a major gap between the diagnosis and the treatment. And that is not least because there is a major distinction in how the United States and allies and partners think about the impact of Chinese government activity on economic security versus national security, right? And sort of the tools that we've historically had have been aimed quite narrowly at national security implications, although the definition of national security itself has always been fairly open-ended. So there was a great deal of flexibility. But we're now in this kind of intensive period of trying to understand how national security and economic security interact and how to manage that, because the solutions are quite different, right? So is access to AI or semiconductors or specific algorithms, is that an economic security concern or a national security concern? The answer is it's both. And when you're trying to grasp too much, it makes it very, very difficult for kind of a rule of law legislative approach to try to tailor the solution so it becomes actually manageable, right? And in the United States, we've seen really kind of a robust articulation of tools to manage the national security impact here, including the reform to CSIS and sort of the ongoing export control regulations on the ECRA. But we have, I think, have been a little bit behind when it comes to addressing some of the economic security risks, such as managing subsidies, which is an eternal problem. And allies and partners are struggling with that as well. Major institutions that we have to manage our economic challenges, like the WTO, are not well suited to addressing this challenge, right, given its kind of pervasive nature. The rising focus on human rights and to a lesser extent on environmental considerations are also shaping the legislative agenda in the US and among allies and partners. But here too, it's rather imprecise. So, how do we look at green technologies where China is a major global player and major producer, and the US policy stance is fairly flexible. So, considering the recent executive order exempting Southeast Asian solar panel imports, for example, right? So the second point I want to make is to really think about how private companies, which are such critical players in this conversation, actually observe China, engage with China. And it's first and foremost really predicated on the health of China's economy, right? So we see appeals from national governments to try to sort of mine the supply chain considerations here. And of course, companies would want to do the best that they can to protect their supply chain security, to stay on the right side of various protections for human rights. But they're also deeply incentivized by how well the Chinese economy is doing. And we see statements come out from various industry associations and trade associations over and over again that speak to needing to be in China, needing to have access to that market. And so policymakers, across the world need to grapple with that, not least because cooperation from the private sector is going to be essential, as the government regulators are almost always playing catch up against the rapid pace of technology development, right? And as we think about kind of what we currently have on the docket in terms of trying to manage various technologies and their development, how to parse access to those key technologies. Government regulators try very hard, but it's always going to be a game of catch up. And then final point here, thinking about this sort of growing transatlantic alignment on core matters. Yes, it's very true, very important. We're thinking about supply chain dependencies. We're thinking about setting standards for certain critical technologies, and we're thinking about protection of human rights. But differences will absolutely remain, right? I think it's important to keep in mind too that sort of a lot of this recent activity, this transatlantic consensus, is really fortified by cooperation between the US and the EU in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? So that's kind of an accelerant. But we can't rely on an accelerant like that to keep our policies aligned, right? So sooner or later, we have to grapple with some of these massive challenges. In many respects, I think the EU policymaking is ahead of the United States here, thinking about the anti-subsidy instrument, thinking about the anti-coercion instrument. So really kind of going to the core of the economic security challenges here. But then on the national security side, sort of on the flip side here, right, the sort of the US regulatory impulse will continue to test the appetite of our allies and partners. So, let's think about outbound investment screening. The revised draft of the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act is very ambitious in scale, which is going to make any sort of coordination difficult. And nobody can agree on everything. And we've seen a sort of an acknowledgement of that in a lot of recent activity, more kind of a mini-lateral arrangements. IPEF is an a la carte sign up. AUKUS, yes, it's a security arrangement primarily, but it has important national economic security implications as well, right? So we have these kind of small groupings. But we should also, despite that, really be prepared for the United States to continue to act unilaterally. At the end of the day, the US government and Congress is very, very positive on that, is going to pursue protection of national interests, regardless of whether allies and partners are sort of all arrayed together in that regard. So let me stop here.
Okay, thank you, Nargiza. Ilaria, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And I really appreciate that Nargiza pointed out that we've known what the issue is for a while, and that the issue is also finding solutions. And what I was going to mention is that I actually just in collaboration with the economics program here at CSIS, we've just published a report where we tried to quantify industrial policy spending in China and 7 other economies. And it's no surprise, I think, to most people, even though this has been sort of a new project, is that China spends a lot more, right? So again, this is not a surprise, but it doesn't really give us any solutions, right? We don't know if industrial policy works. We don't know how distortive it is. And we don't know whether it is replicable. And I point this out because, and we don't know how it can be corrected, right? Or rather, we know we have ideas, but this doesn't tell us necessarily doesn't give us a simple solution. And I mention these because I think when it comes to China's statecraft and state capitalism, there's various impulses that you see across the board. One is to replicate, right? To spend just as much as China and target the same industries. Another one is to try and block China, right? To try and slow China down while trying to catch up, or maybe not trying to catch up, but just sort of keeping at the same pace. And then finally, there is an issue of, can there be solutions, institutional solutions, multilateral solutions, or bilateral solutions to try and sort of curb this, the most distortive or impactful policies that are coming out of China, such as we've been talking about subsidies. Of course, there's a lot of implicit and explicit subsidies, right? And many of them just derive out of China's very economic system, right? They may actually be very difficult to change even if the will were there, right? So I think one thing to keep in mind that there's significant trade-offs. And not to be negative, right? I think these are very important things. I think Nargiza laid out, I think, very well many of the different options that are available. And I agree with François that the European Union has some very impressive tools that it has been working on. But there are some significant trade-offs. And I think Some of those trade-offs have to do with the domestic economy, and some have to do with the relationship with partners, right? A lot of these tools tend to have some more protectionist sides to them, right? I think you certainly see that in the US, the Defense Production Act, right? It certainly has some more controversial sides to it that that partners may not appreciate. So that actually has the risk of creating a wedge between the US and the European Union, or even other partners such as Japan or South Korea, right? And certainly there's tension sometimes. One thing that I would like to point out is, we talk about semiconductors, right? Again, as Nargiza said, both an economic and national security priority. But at the same time, because of that, we're seeing a proliferation of CHIPS Act across the world. Now, whether or not this is purely positive or are there trade-offs to it, I think we'd have to look into a single case, right? And all these CHIPS Acts, they all have the same name. They're actually quite different in nature, but there's potential for certain tensions to emerge between partners. Another area that I would like to point out, which again Nargiza pointed out, is clean tech. Right, this has actually in the U.S. been a highly controversial, or rather has really highlighted the paradox in the Biden administration's policy. While on the one hand, we have very laudable climate targets, those relying, at least in the short term, in many cases on Chinese supply chains. And so when at the same time, we've had targets of increasing American manufacturing and reducing reliance on Chinese supply chains, that has created a bit of a conflict. And I think that's really come to a head this month, where we've seen the sort of suspension of tariffs on Southeast Asian, on imports from certain Southeast Asian countries, and the Defense Production Act. And I think that really highlights that if you introduce those sort of barriers to sort of slow down Chinese imports or reduce the reliance on supply chains, but you're not introducing enough positive policies domestically or in coordination with partners to provide alternatives, you really do not have quite much of a solution at all, right? Because you're just raising costs, and you're essentially demanding that those, if you're talking about products like solar panels, which are largely dominated by Chinese production, in the short term, if you don't have an alternative, that creates serious challenges. And I think that's just something to keep in mind, because there's a lot of talk of nearshoring and friendshoring, which are all very laudable long-term targets. But in the short term, I think we need to talk more seriously about the Chinese supply chains and how we will continue to be highly reliant on those for the foreseeable future. And so I think that creates a real challenge in both the relationship between the US and the EU, and also the relationship with China. So I think those are just all points to think about, and I look forward to having more of a discussion on all this.
Well, thank you, Ilaria, and thank all of you. When I listened to your remarks, I did sort of, I could kind of tease out one common thread, and that has to do with sort of what US allies and partners are doing, and kind of why and when they did it. And so, for example, Matt, you mentioned that Japan seems to have kind of come to the realization earlier, perhaps in the US, about China. And then several of you mentioned that the EU has developed some new trade tools, which in the context of the EU trade policy are, if not revolutionary, at least kind of a step change. And Ilaria, you just mentioned the fact that a number of economies are thinking about subsidizing their own chip production. So I guess my question to start things off would be, what given that allies and partners, the two, I think, the two big ones for the United States, when you think of China, Japan, and the EU, seem to have, am I right that it sounds like in Japan, I'm right about this? I mean, am I right also that the EU kind of organically and internally came through its own process to the conclusion they need to have different tools with China rather than because of US pressure? And if so, if it's true that these two principal like-minded partners have made significant changes in their policy towards China, I guess my question is, what does that suggest about the possibility for cooperation, right? We have on sort of the trade side, you've got the trilateral initiative, US, EU, Japan. Then you have a kind of a one bilateral, the US and the EU, of another kind of plurilateral framework with Asia through the IPEF. I mean, what's your sense of how much the US and the EU can actually align? For example, François, what's the chance that given the changes in EU trade policy, that there's ways for the US and the EU to actually sort of do some kind of joint implementation, right? That's just one example. But so I wanted to throw that out, in terms of what your sense is of the prospects for US cooperation with the EU and Japan on some of the issues you've all discussed: supply chains, sensitive technologies, human rights, green tech.
Yeah, first, just to come back a little bit on the convergence in terms of analysis that Nargiza just pointed out. It's a huge change. The EU was a couple of years behind the US. I think Matt referred to 2014. I would say the EU made that kind of acknowledgement in around 2019. I would say that Ms. von der Leyen Commission was probably a nice date to remember as this kind of, it's a process, but I think it's really the tipping point of that process, that basically China was not going to converge, and it was probably going to diverge further in terms of economic model. And then starting from that analysis, then what shall we do? That's in terms of analysis. Then in terms of capacity, there is limited, if not no convergence at all. First, because the EU is a different type of beast than the US. It's not a nation, it's not a state per se. And I think that answers in part your question of where do we see cooperations. It's really a topic by topic discussion, largely dependent on EU political capacity. The ability, for instance, in terms of export control, as we've seen through the TTC and through the example of what happened following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen state to state, EU member state coordination with the US mitigated or supervised or incentivized by the European Union. For instance, you mentioned a tool of outward investment screening. This is hardly possible for the European Union as the European Union. It's first, ideologically, the European Union is, let's say, further down, further up the road in terms of acknowledging any need there. And then in terms of capacity, it's not mandated to conduct such operations. National security is still a national responsibility within the EU. So anything that touches on national security, actually, the US needs to cooperate with EU member states. It can be mitigated, organized, supervised, facilitated by the European Union through the TTC as a good example, probably. But this has to be bear in mind. And then the last point, and I think it's more of a horizontal issue, the European Union does not have the same ideological capacity of looking at geopolitical or geopolicy in general, and geopolitics, and how much cost it could be willing to bear in the pursuit of geopolitical objectives. The EU has basically not taken any cost for the past decades for pursuing geopolitical objectives. It has in part free riding some of the US objective. It has mitigating some of the spillovers at home, but the ability to collectively set an objective and say we are willing to bear some costs. The first time we actually did it was probably with Ukraine. But this is a very specific situation where you have a war on our continent that very directly affects a large number of our Eastern member states. In a case of an economic competition with a faraway country as China, as big as it is, there is still a question of, is the EU willing to change its mindset towards becoming a geopolitical entity on the world stage? And that is still a pending question. I think the crux of the discussion is actually ongoing now, largely because of the Ukraine situation in Germany and in some Nordic country where this more liberal economic-based approach to global order and global interaction is still largely prevalent.
I want to let the others comment, but I could just quickly follow up with you on one aspect of what you said. What about trade policy more specifically? Because there the EU is, in a sense, does act like a nation state. And, you know, maybe I spend too much time in the basement of US-EU trade relations. But if you look at the communique from the last Trade and Technology Council meeting on, I think it's the next to last page, there's a small chapter about anti-coercion, and it suggests that the US and the EU will cooperate on joint approaches to anti-coercion, right? Which means mostly about China. So what about that? You know, again, maybe the devil's in the details. What does that mean to align your approaches? Because after all, we have our trade laws, and the United States has its trade laws, and the EU has its trade laws. But the EU is a trade superpower. So how would you look at that issue?
I think, I mean, my analysis would be that there will be cooperation in terms of information sharing, trying to have joint reaction to potential coercion by China, but that will not be institutionalized. It will be a case-by-case approach because, I mean, first, we don't know what the legal tool in the EU will actually look like at the end, and how much member states will be able to voice their concern or voice their own preferences within that instrument that is largely an ongoing fierce discussion between the Parliament and the Commission and the Council. And so even wherever we land, member states will want to keep some form of capacity to opt out or even to veto, which creates issues for the implementability or at least the credibility of the EU on that matter. But cooperation, and I think especially with this administration and the case of Ukraine, building a lot of trust between two transatlantic partners, and that was definitely highly needed. But still, it's going to be, I think, a bumpy road, and don't overestimate the capacity of the EU to go down that road. One example, I think, and speaking of trade policy, for instance, will be on bilateral trade agreements. You have the EU having in the pipes a couple of very significant trade agreements geopolitically wise. I'm thinking of Mercosur, New Zealand, for instance. And I think, unfortunately, there are some very big doubts that the EU is able to conduct, to actually implement and ratify those agreements because of internal political divides. And that is just a trade agreement. That is not opposing or putting sanction on a huge partner as China that has counter-coercive capacities. And so I think it's important that intentions are there, but the EU starts from much further away, and we are going down that road. But I think it's good that everyone acknowledges and not overestimate the European capacity to join with the US.
How do the rest of you see this issue of the potential for US cooperation with partners? With EU, Japan, others? Matt, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we'll continue to see, obviously there has been coordination in this space sort of all along. And we'll continue to sort of, I think, and I don't mean this to sound pejorative, but we'll continue to muddle through our coordination as our coordination is always sort of, we'll continue to sort of work through those things. Of course, it will continue to center around member states, given that this is the intersection of trade policy and national security. I think, for a variety of purposes, we have these discussions about anti-coercion measures, but obviously the actions that Beijing is taking against Lithuania comes to mind, which you've got an EU member, and a NATO member, essentially being embargoed by the PRC, and that's causing a number of things to run across the EU as other members have to deal with that. We have a similar thing happening to Australia. So of course, it's going to continue to sort of, that coordination will continue to happen at member state level, state to state. And I would expect we will build out sort of new institution methods. I think one of the things we're going to find coming out of Ukraine is that we'll see a new dual-use export control regime. The Wassenaar arrangement, right, which had previously governed or continues to govern dual-use exports, includes Russia, which is unfortunate, and there is no way under the Wassenaar arrangement for anyone to be voted out of that. So I suspect we will build a new one, and that is where we will likely coordinate all of the nascent activities that are happening and going on around dual-use export controls that are happening at member state level. And I think it's bears keeping in mind that sort of not every country sits at the table technology piece. So when you look at sort of members of the EU, I mean, you only have a handful that actually have the capabilities that are in sort of high-tech semiconductor production. And so I suspect we'll continue to see the sort of makeshift setting up of coordination, and that will likely lead to new sort of institutions that will govern those sorts of activities, because these ones likely won't go away.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this? Because
yeah,
go ahead, Ilaria, please.
Yeah. I would say that I think there's also going to need to be a lot of conversation on what the priority areas should be and the priority industries, right? I think it's just unrealistic to think that in every area we're going to be able to not rely on Chinese supply chains. I think there's an aim for diversification and resilient supply chains, but I think it's just it's not realistic to think that Chinese supply chains can be completely cut out, at least for non-security, non-military goals, right? And then so I think that will be important. And then I think actually finding what the most effective solutions are is also important. I mean, I think we've found over the past few years that tariffs are not a very good solution when it comes to creating more resilient supply chains. Otherwise, I think with the Trump era tariffs, we would have solved the problem of over-reliance on Chinese supply chains. But we're still here talking about the solar panels coming from Southeast Asia, but still being Chinese solar panels, right? Like, I think it's not necessarily a complete solution. And let me note that solar panels are much more expensive in the U.S. than they are in Europe, for example, and certainly China. So I think there needs to be more. I think the collaboration, the space for collaboration, the potential for coordination collaboration is also in finding tools that are effective in reaching the goals, which will also have to be, I think, very clearly defined. And I think that's going to continue to be a challenge. And I think it's great then that we do have some platforms for that type of conversation, but I think we'll need more of those platforms and more of those conversations. And I think that also very good data on this will also be very important, right? I think there will need to be a lot of data sharing and real-time tracking of what companies are doing and what these supply chains actually look like, which will require a lot more capacity for monitoring and enforcing. So that's just my 2 cents on that.
Ilaria, who could do that work you just mentioned of getting a handle on what these supply chains look like and what that means for policy? I mean, is that something that the U.S. and the EU could do bilaterally? Something like that a group like the OECD should do? I mean, how would we do that?
I think the OECD is actually doing very good work on this.
Okay.
The OECD does brilliant work on this, and perhaps they need to be given even more support for doing this further. I think ultimately it's going to have to be probably even at the domestic level, right? It probably will end up being, I mean, the European Commission, I think, actually could do, has been doing these kinds of works, and I think that it could happen in coordination with the Trade and Technology Council, perhaps the IPEF, we'll see what the IPEF ends up looking like, but perhaps that might be also a platform. But I don't actually have a direct answer. I think this will have to come from many different channels, right? I think there's here in DC, there's a whole plethora of think tanks like ours that are working on topics like these, and I think but it's surprising, I think, how little we actually have a handle on what's happening on the ground. And I think that's due to, we've also coming out of 2 years of COVID where nobody's been traveling, right? But also I think it's just very complex and firms change things all the time. And I don't think we always have a very realistic understanding of how these business decisions are made, right? I think there's actually only so much that can be done in terms of reorganizing supply chains in the short term, because these are very complex creatures that have evolved over decades due to business decisions, right? And I'm not saying that, but I think that's why we may have to have very targeted initiatives that are very narrow in some of their targets. Sorry, I see Matt is wanting to.
Matt, yes.
Yeah, just a quick two-finger. I think it bears keeping in mind that much of the reason why we have like a hyper concentration of manufacturing in the PRC, particularly around electronics, is because Europe, Japan, Korea, the United States all followed a series of sort of policies to sort of encourage convergence and integration of the Chinese market. And that as those policies begin to change, the business models that were well designed for those geopolitical conditions, as the geopolitical conditions change, the business models begin to shift as well. And so I think it's extremely hard for us to imagine how that's going to happen, right? Except that it likely will happen, right? So it's just that as costs go up on producing in the PRC for a variety of purposes, whether that's the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, whether that's for various other sorts of things going into play, mean that business will start making decisions about where they put things. And as they do that, we'll see different supply chains come out, right? And so it seems to me that this is sort of that supply chains follow the geopolitics as opposed to the other way around.
Nargiza?
I think it's a really important point to acknowledge that supply chains follow economics as well, right? The degree to which US-EU alignment on any of these things is actually contingent on policy mistakes by the Chinese government cannot be overstated, right? If the Chinese government chooses to administer its economy that is statist, that makes it very uncertain that companies can be successful, that undermines everything that has done sort of made the Chinese economy so successful. A lot of it was trade distorting, and some of it was not, right? They have done important steps to try to make the economy more efficient, more productive. All those things are now being undercut in many respects by the Chinese government itself, right? To speak to this supply chain realignment as a long-term structural change, companies need to want to go somewhere else. No amount of fleeting and cajoling and threatening is going to be sufficient, and it's not in the nature of liberal, open, markets to micromanage every company's behavior. And so there needs to be a systemic shift as well. And a good chunk of that is actually being precipitated by the Chinese government's decisions here.
François.
Yeah, and that to follow a bit what was just said now. I mean, yes, we are going to muddle through. And we are going to muddle through first because it's a good, we're going to muddle through and it's a good thing. First, because at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that now we live in a world where potentially a next Trump-like administration in the US is definitely a large, a not central, but a not too marginal hypothesis that in the EU we have to live with. And so we cannot make our plans as if the US are going to be the easy playing ally and partner that we have in general. Easy might be a bit too strong here, but at least in terms of trust and similarity of preferences, we can no longer make that projection when we create our approach and strategy to stuff. So we are going to muddle through because it's going to be a case by case each time, depending on which administration is there. It's not only the US. Obviously, the Trump situation caught all the limelight, but if you look at the last French election, it's no longer either a guarantee that the European Union as it is will always be a US aligned, NATO like-minded partner for the next decades to come. In the French national elections, the candidates that ended up second and third, even fourth, I think, in the polls, had very pro-Russian and anti-American lines throughout their lives. I'm not saying is going to be always the case, but that was the reality, I think, that both sides of the Atlantic have to acknowledge. And then comes another reason why we are going to muddle through, which is almost natural or inherent to the situation we are going through, is that we are going through uncharted territories. We had never looked in the modern era at economic international interlinkages through the lens of national economic security. It's a new way of approaching stuff, at least in Europe for sure, in the US a bit less so, but definitely a different type of perspective onto the world. And the previous perspective was just looking at maximizing economic efficiency. And that has a simple metric of control, growth, and that has a rather easygoing sets of tools, which was to liberalize the economy. Now the problem is we no longer have an easy metric, and the tools, well, there are much more potentials and much more potential tools to be used, and much more complicated a decision to be made along the way. So yes, we're going to muddle through, but we have to acknowledge that it's actually a rather healthy and genuine way to move forward. And I think it's important to have that front and center when we have those conversations. Modeling through is not necessarily negative. I know we have a tendency to prefer to institutionalize and systematize cooperations, but at some point when the preferences are not there to underpin that reality, we just have to live with a secondary best type of approach.
Ilaria, what do you think of muddling through?
I think I actually completely agree. I think muddling through that's what I was pointing at, the short term versus long term, right? I think in the short term, the idea that you're going to see a dramatic change from one day to the next is just completely, I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that's going to be the case, right? But I think that's just why I encourage people to think more of, in the short term, we're going to continue to be reliant on Chinese supply chains, and there's going to be very frustrating conversations that are going to move very slowly. That said, I think, yes, supply chains can follow the economics, they can also follow the politics, but that's going to require having better standards, right? Stricter standards. Think for human rights, right? You need to have better ways of tracking supply chains and certifying them, right? Standards for environmental, I think there was a question on ESG, right? But that actually is quite challenging for the EU and the US sometimes to agree on those standards, right? I think if we think of the GDPR and data protection, for example, there's very deep differences there, right? In some ways, China is almost closer to the European Union in terms of the laws that is introduced compared to the US, right? And I don't mean to say, but I just think that is the part of the muddling through, right? It may end up being where one block, the European Union and the US take different paths, right? And both paths may work for each one, but it may not be completely joint, right? It may be coordinated, but might not joint. And I think that's probably going to be the case in many of these spaces. I think, when François said, I think it's going to be issue by issue, that's probably true, right? And I think that's part of the muddling through part of it. So, yeah.
Well, let's get to this question we have from a viewer who asked, to what degree, if any, will increased ESG scrutiny impact China with respect to companies operating there, as well as global investments made by China? Why don't we hear your views on that? Nargiza, would you like to offer something, or?
I'll be happy to jump in. So I think it's certainly going to be important, right? But it goes back to this question of what is ESG? What are the standards? There is no agreement within even individual country. Different providers often offer different definitions. Does G in governance include democratic governance? Right? How do we think about human rights in this context? It's going to be, I think, increasingly more important for us to achieve some sort of a coordination within the economy first, right? I'd love for the United States to coordinate better, like within the United States to coordinate better before we try to achieve some sort of a transatlantic alignment here. So I think that's the first one. I think the second really important consideration is that the politics of it are going to matter quite a bit. So it's not just ESG, it's ESG plus. To what extent are the companies that you're investigating or the behaviors that you're investigating support the military-industrial complex, for example, right? How are these technologies being deployed, not just what they do? And how is the company connected to other companies in its node, right? And sort of increasingly, as we look at how the Chinese government has been trying to adjust and kind of flex its industrial policy and how it adjudicates development of certain critical technologies, we see this effort to build a much more networked, much more systematic kind of spin-off system, which is incredibly difficult to achieve, right? To Ilaria's point, we don't know if it works. We don't know how successful these efforts tend to be. But if we think about ESG as being kind of like a silver bullet, that's not going to be possible. It can be a very active tool. It is certainly going to be part of the arsenal, and it is something that is, for now at least, is almost entirely led by the private sector, right? So we're going to see kind of this proliferation of various definitions and offerings, which may be sufficient to move the needle in some regard. But I think on certain matters like adherence to human rights protections, for example, the governments will need to continue to play a pretty active role.
And I think, the idea of using ESG as metrics to shape outcomes, has to be sort of really only conceptualized within societies that have transparency and rule of law. We are watching, unfold sort of the destruction of the auditing, the forced labor auditing provisions that had been in place inside the PRC are being dismantled. As NGOs and various other social groups are essentially forced out of either business of conducting audit factory. And so therefore companies and sort of dependable assertions about meeting ESG metrics only in those places where it could actually be independently observed and measured. And I think that's simply not the case in the PRC. This is the world's largest carbon emitter. And the more that we move manufacturing to the PRC, likely the more that that manufacturing has an even greater carbon footprint, even as companies then claim that they're reducing it inside other countries. So it just seems quite odd to me that in a world in which you don't have transparency or some degree of rule of law, that ESG will be an important metric in being able to sort of shape the outcomes of this.
François, maybe we'll give you the last word from Brussels.
I was going to be specific on ESG, but I wanted to highlight the fact that forced labor is a very nice example of everything that we're talking about, kind of. We have now totally convergent analysis, led initially by the US, but now the EU is on board with a similar analysis that what is going on in Xinjiang is unacceptable, and creates large-scale forced labor to a point that creates serious distortions along our value chains. The similar ambitions, we want to do something about it, and we want to be forceful. Even on the EU side, the proposition actually has teeth, which was not necessarily obvious 2 or 3 years ago. But when we look at the tools, it's actually very different. The approach of the EU is indeed has teeth, but is not as ambitious, as coercive as could the EU envision, the actual US implemented instrument. And then comes the question of capacity. And in the EU, if you look at the latest declaration by the head of Volkswagen, for instance, you do have a sense that there is a question of whether we will be able to enforce a tool that has actual teeth, and we will be able to withstand the countermeasures from China. And so I think it's a very good example. It could be a very good test bed of our ability to cooperate, build trust, and to withstand Chinese pressure together. Because the whole idea is that the more you are to confront China, the less you have individually pressure to support on your own economy. And I think it's going to be a very clear case. And to be a bit gloomy, if the EU on that is not able to prove that it's becoming a geopolitical entity, I think it will have to acknowledge that its ambition have to restrict to its neighbors, and going beyond the Mediterranean Sea and Central Europe, there is no actual capacity to bear any costs, so there is limited credibility. So it should better tone down its ambition. If it does proves that it can withstand the Chinese pressure on such a sensitive topic on the Chinese side, then indeed it will have definitely step up its game and could envisage having an Indo-Pacific ambition and so on.
Thanks, Francois. Let me, just as a concluding remark, say that when I listened to what I thought was a very rich discussion, I think there was this common sense that we may not be able to institutionalize a lot of the cooperation that we are kind of brewing now in different more informal kinds of fora, like the Trade and Technology Council or the IPEF. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some capacity to actually develop effective tools together. And I think that's a very good lesson in general for policy, that you don't have to have everything be institutionalized or treaty based, and particularly if there's enough trust among partners that we may be able together, the United States and its main partners together will be able to develop some useful tools when we look at the challenge from China's state capitalism. So with that, let me thank all of you for taking your time to participate on both sides of the Atlantic with us at AICGS. And let me thank again the Hans Seidel Foundation and Christian Forstner for the cooperation on this great project, which we've had over the last several months. And wish all of you in the United States and in Europe a good morning and afternoon. So long.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.